So, welcome to my kitchen in Brighton. This is Patrick McGuigan. I'm a cheese writer and cheese journalist. Unfortunately, we can't be at the Edinburgh Science Festival. So myself and Paul Thomas are going to do a little snippet of what we would have talked about in Cheeseology. It would have been our 5th year doing the Cheeseology talk. So I'm in my kitchen. I've got 3 cheeses. We're going to look at the melting properties of cheese. So I'm going to hand you over to Paul in a moment. I just wanted to show you. I'm just about to pop these cheeses in the oven. We've got a cheddar. This is the cheddar, parmesan, and a halloumi. So I'm going to put that in the oven now. Over to you, Paul Thomas.
Hi, and I am Paul Thomas. I work as a dairy technologist and a cheese making instructor. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the factors that influence the melting properties and the stretching properties of cheese. Before I do that, there's a couple of things that we need to know. That is that cheese making and cheese melting and stretching are very pH dependent. With milk, we have a pH of 6.6, which is fairly close to neutral. During the cheese make, that pH will come down, and the degree to which it comes down will depend very much on the cheese variety. As an example, cheddar, when we start to break up and salt those curds, will have come down to a pH of about 5.2, 5.3, whereas some of the softer cheeses might come down to a lower pH value, say 4.8 or 4.6. The melting properties of cheese, we'll see in a minute, when the cheeses come out of the grill, are highly dependent on that pH value. What we'd see is that very high pH cheeses, so those with a pH of 6 or thereabouts, won't tend to melt, won't tend to stretch very well. We would expect cheese to have optimum melting and stretching properties when we get to a pH value of around about 5.0 to 5.4, which puts us very much in the cheddar category. When we're making cheeses like mozzarella, which are stretched as part of their cheese making process, we have to achieve that pH value in order to achieve the melt and stretch. But when we go to lower values, say lower than 4.8, we find that the melting and stretching properties of the cheese become inhibited. How are we getting on with the cheeses in the grill now?
That's interesting about the pH, because I thought calcium played a big part in how cheeses stretch and melt. Let me just check my oven before you.
So
let's just see how we're going here. The cheddar's starting. It's been 2 minutes. The cheddar's starting to melt. It's getting quite oily on the parmesan, and the halloumi is not doing much. So I'm going to put them back in.
So you're right there. Yes, the properties are related to the amount of calcium phosphate, which is retained within the big network of protein that we have within the cheese. The amount of calcium that's going to be retained there is dependent on that pH value. So it's the pH which is the driving factor, but it's the calcium which is the mechanism that allows for melting or not melting. So
the acidity levels will remove some of the calcium.
That's right.
It melts it.
Yeah. As acidity is produced within the curd, it starts to displace the calcium phosphate from the network of casein, the protein within the cheese. We have quite a lot of calcium phosphate retained within the cheese when the pH is 6 or above. As we start approaching a pH value of around about 5.2, 5.3, which would be our optimum point for melting and stretching, we find that maybe about 75% of the calcium phosphate is going to be shed from the curds. And that loosens the interaction between all the proteins, and it allows them to start flowing and moving around. Whereas before, the calcium phosphate forces them to be very rigid. They're very much stuck in place.
I'm just checking the cheese again, Paul.
Very
Carry
good.
on.
What we should probably talk about is the relative pH values of the cheeses that we're looking at today. Halloumi is a high pH cheese. There's very little acidification that takes place in that cheese during cheese making. And the final pH value would come out at around about 6 to 5.8 at the lowest. And this would mean that halloumi, well, we wouldn't expect that to melt particularly well. Cheeses like cheddar were coming down into the low 5s, somewhere between 5 and 5.4, and we would expect very similar values with the Parmesan. There's one complication here, and that is that Parmesan is aged for a very long period of time. And the aging process has an effect on the proteins, which stops its ability to melt and flow. If we were to look at some lower pH cheeses here, maybe some lactic goat's curd or lactic goat's cheese like Celsius-Share or Crottin de Chavignol, typically we'd find the very low pH center of those cheeses, they wouldn't melt particularly well at all. And that's because we've lost so much of the calcium phosphate that actually the protein will begin to aggregate. It'll start to bunch up instead of starting to melt and flow.
So, sorry, I just wanted to, so you can see I've moved these onto a board. The halloumi needs a bit longer, but the cheddar is an absolute puddle. Can you see that?
Yep.
It's absolutely, I mean, that is perfect. That we're ready to eat that. The Parmesan has sort of kept its shape, and it's sort of, both of them are giving off quite a lot of oil, quite oily cheese, like the oil sort of, but the Parmesan sort of kept its shape more. And there's these little white dots. I don't know if you can see them, these little white dots that have appeared. Is that salt that's coming out? That's
either described as being calcium lactate crystals or tyrosine crystals. There's been some debate over the years as to whether it is calcium lactate or tyrosine. Tyrosine is an amino acid that's released during the breakdown of the proteins within the cheese. Calcium lactate is a substance which is formed from the lactic acid which has been created by our starter bacteria during the ripening of the cheese. It forms into a kind of mirror image version of the calcium lactate molecule that is less soluble and forms a solid crystal.
So that pH, you were saying about getting that perfect pH, the cheddar has melted absolutely beautifully.
Yep.
Parmesan, not bad, but still kind of holding its shape a little bit. The flavour is much stronger actually. When you taste that melted Parmesan, it really gives you a big hit of flavour, which I presume is why it's so good grated on pasta.
Yeah, and that's it. Parmesan doesn't tend to be a particularly good melting cheese, especially as it gets much older. The older the cheese gets, the more proteolysis we'll get, the more breakdown of the proteins. And as they break down, they lose the ability to flow. Instead, they'll start to aggregate. But there's a lot of very strongly flavored fatty acids within the Parmesan, which will enhance the flavor development. We'd also expect to see a lot of oiling off with the Parmesan as well.
Yeah, it's actually all over the board now, the oil that's come off.
Yeah, so as that protein network is breaking down, the cheese loses the ability to hang on to the oil, and so we see a lot more free oil coming off.
And in fact, the halloumi's now done. It's going, I hope you can sort of see that, it's going a nice sort of it's caramelizing a bit around the edges. It's completely held its shape. I mean, it's not melted at all. It's dried out a little bit, if anything. But as basically, you know, it's a bit softer, but it's not running in the same way that the cheddar and the Parmesan were.
So there we have a lot of calcium phosphate retained within the curds because it's a very high pH cheese. That gives the cheese a very rigid, structured network. It inhibits the ability of the cheese to melt and flow. It also makes the texture of the cheese a little bit more chewy and kind of elastic. And the other interesting thing that we see there, the browning of the cheese, well, that's because there's a lot of residual sugars. It's the sugar in the milk which is being turned into acidity during the cheese make. And because halloumi is a high pH cheese, it has a lot of residual sugar. And that residual sugar is going to start browning. It's a kind of Maillard reaction.
The Maillard, so it caramelizes just like if you were making a caramel sauce in your pan at home.
Absolutely.
That's brilliant. I mean, they're all good in their own way. I mean, halloumi is great as a sort of, people use it as a meat substitute, don't they? Sales of halloumi have gone through the roof as people have looked to cut down on meat in their diets, and more people are becoming vegetarian. So great, as like in a burger or just on a barbecue, and yeah, cheddar that's just perfect. I'm gonna have cheese on toast. I've got to get some toast going after this.
Absolutely, and cheddar is the perfect cheese on toast cheese. The pH value is just right. The age is just right. It's not aged for so long that we have that problem with the proteins bunching up, and we still have a nice amount of flavour.
Brilliant. Well, brilliant. That's really interesting, Paul, and I hope that's been useful for people at home. We'll be back next year. Everything going well, we'll be back for Cheeseology, the 5th one in our 6th year, next year at the Edinburgh Science Festival. But hopefully that's given you a little taster of what we would have done this year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and stay safe, everyone.
Stay safe.